Yeah, cool. Um,
Do,
okay.
do we want to wait to see, because I know we have a couple other people who are coming.
Yeah, we should have more attendees
Maybe,
coming, but
maybe just wait a couple minutes. Just
I
one.
think we'll wait what, like one
Yeah.
minute. Oh, we have another
Yeah.
person. Cool. Should I just get started and then other people can join if they like.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Cool. All right. So I'll first start off by asking, could everyone please introduce yourself and your organization's role in dealing with human trafficking and worker exploitation? So whoever wants to start first. But...
I can start for you. My name is Joanne Hand, and I work for Hagar New Zealand. And we are a charity that works with survivors of slavery, trafficking, and abuse globally. So we have program work in Afghanistan, Vietnam, Cambodia. We're now in the Solomon Islands. And although our work started with intense trauma recovery, we've kind of branched out and seen it more as a holistic issue, that because human trafficking affects the world, that we have to engage in legal processes, social services processes, and building the capacity of the nations we work in. So my role with Hagar is to advocate and to raise funds for the work that we do globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne.
Kia ora, I'm Morgan and I'm the Advocacy Campaigns and Communications Manager here at World Vision New Zealand. World Vision is a global relief, development and advocacy organization, and we work in over 100 countries around the world. In my role, I manage our advocacy campaigns. So the one that we've been working on for the past 3 years is to get modern slavery legislation in New Zealand. So this legislation would address the risks of modern slavery in our supply chains, both domestically and internationally. And I can speak more about that throughout this panel.
That sounds good.
I'm Eleanor Parkes. I'm the director of ECPAT New Zealand, ECPAT Child Alert. So this is the New Zealand member of ECPAT International. We're a global movement all working against child sexual exploitation. So it's all around trafficking and exploitation, but with that particular focus on children and on sex trafficking. And here we focus specifically on New Zealand children who might be at risk of being exploited here, and New Zealand children who are at risk of trafficking or exploitation elsewhere around the world.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah. So I think the first question that we'll ask is about the new proposed modern slavery legislation from Labour that's quite recent. Eleanor, may I ask you first, how will this new proposed modern slavery legislation impact the well-being of children?
Well, great question. I will probably be best to throw this one to Joanne and Morgan, who are both colleagues on the Human Trafficking Research Coalition, by the way. We all do work together, and this is a piece of legislation that the coalition really supported, but it was led out of World Vision and I believe Tier Fund. So I'll let them speak to the many benefits of it and how it might impact children. For our focus at ECPAT being on New Zealand children, this legislation isn't as relevant because it's more supply chain legislation, the exploitation happening elsewhere in the world. So I might, if it's all right, pass that one over to Morgan, who'd be best suited to speak to that.
Yeah, I definitely can speak to that. So the legislation that has been proposed is a modern slavery disclosure law. So what it will require is businesses to assess the risks of modern slavery in their supply chains and then publicly report on those risks and how they're addressing them. In terms of how it would impact children, I mean, I think we know overseas there's a lot of children forced into labor to make things like the shoes we're wearing, the chocolate that we eat, clothes that we're wearing. And so I think this is going to be a really good start in terms of companies becoming more aware of the risks of child labor in their supply chains, because a lot of companies just don't know, they've never looked into it. And so we're really hoping that this is a good first step. What we do really need to see in this law is the next step, which is something called due diligence. So this would require companies to not just learn about the risks and report on them, but actually take action to address and mitigate these risks. In terms of in New Zealand, the way that this legislation will impact the domestic context is going to be, I believe, just bringing a lot of awareness around exploitation, particularly migrant exploitation in many of our sectors, including construction, agriculture, hospitality, viticulture. I'm not actually too familiar, maybe one of my other colleagues would know, in terms of the statistics around children that are exploited in labor in New Zealand, but I do think that it would probably be significantly lower than overseas. So I think, yeah, in terms of children, we're mostly going to see this impact in the overseas work.
Oh, great. Now I'll ask a question to Joanne about, does this new legislation sort of reflect what you'd want to see in other countries, and how does it compare internationally?
Okay, I think it's a start for New Zealand. And as we've seen with the other modern slavery acts around the world, that without the due diligence, where people have to identify the slave labor and abuse in their supply chains, have some legal obligation to mitigate it and respond towards it and research it in their supply chains. That's going to be a beginning for New Zealand, and other countries are already doing this. So it is important for us because at the moment as consumers, we have no idea of the food items, material items that we're buying, how far into the supply chain is there child and slave labor.
Thank you. I think I'll step back a bit actually, and we'll talk more about your individual organizations. So Morgan, is it okay if I ask sort of what does World Vision do to for human trafficking and mitigating it?
Yeah, so as mentioned, the big thing we're working on right now is the modern slavery legislation piece, which we think, what has been announced by government is a great first step in that. And of course, we do want to see this due diligence element, so that's what we're going to continue advocating for. Other ways that we are working on policy in New Zealand is we've been advocating for the Crimes Act to be amended to better protect children from sexual exploitation in New Zealand, and we've been doing this alongside the other colleagues on this panel through the Human Trafficking Research Coalition. So right now, the definition is not in line with the international definition in the Palermo Protocol. As in New Zealand, to be considered a case of child trafficking, it requires evidence of coercion or deception, when these both should be irrelevant when the victim is a child. And so this also means that currently all forms of child trafficking are not being recognized in New Zealand. So we're really trying to amend that definition to not include those two elements, so that more cases are recognized for what they are, and those cases can be sentenced properly.
Great. Eleanor, what work is ECPAT doing at the moment for human trafficking and child exploitation?
Thanks, Olivia. Whole range of things. We, some years ago, had more of a focus on perpetrators of this type of abuse that were in New Zealand, who might be traveling overseas and exploiting children there, like through the travel and tourism industry. So we were doing a lot of campaigning and awareness raising around that, and also people who might be perpetrators online. So again, seeking out vulnerable people overseas and exploiting them. Increasingly really well placed to be able.
So sorry about that. My internet died. Yep.
That's all right. We're now really well placed to be able to share that information. So not just publicly through reports, but also directly into government. So we've been placing ourselves so that we're on advisory boards and advisory panels at a government level. Experiences of frontline workers and the experiences of people at risk or people who have been exploited are right there. It's so important that decisions aren't made without children at the centre and without the people most at risk, you know, those survivors at the centre. So that's something we've increasingly been focusing on being able to provide alongside other support services, training, campaigning, a lot of advocacy, that kind of thing.
The 2023 Trafficking in Prisons report saw some improvements from 2021, which sort of included increased trafficking investigations and soliciting feedback from organizations and the private sector. So have you all seen an improvement regarding your work?
I mean, I can just jump in and maybe we can kind of popcorn around. But I would say, I mean, for us, we've been, you know, we were campaigning for this legislation and for this announcement for 3 years. And so to see it happen was definitely a big win for us. Of course, it's not everything we wanted to see. We want that due diligence component. But I think it's a really good sign that New Zealand is stepping up. You know, all other Commonwealth countries have this legislation in place or have already announced that they're going to be introducing it. And so we were really lagging behind there. And it's nice to see that we've, you know, caught up now. I actually, now that I'm thinking about it, though, I don't think that was reflected in that tip report, but it will, I'm sure, be in the next one. And so I think just in terms of seeing that progress, it's been great. There's, you know, there's a lot of other ways I think we really need to improve, and we're slowly starting to improve. So, for example, the government introduced a few measures to better protect migrant workers, or will at least give them an avenue to report complaints. So in 2021, there was the worker hotline that was made available. There's the migrant exploitation protection visa made available, and we saw increases in complaints. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Just because there's increases in complaints doesn't mean that there's increases in instances, but it just means that people are able to report. However, what we did see was between 2021 and 2022, there were over 1,000 complaints to the hotline, and only 10% were investigated. So you can have this hotline, which is great. People can report what's going on, but if it's not actually followed up properly with an investigation and taken care of, then really what's the point with that? And so I think we also, you know, we need to see more resources allocated to following those up, and then as well take a more preventative approach. So I was really happy to see recently that the Minister of Immigration called for a review into the accredited employer work visa scheme, which ties a migrant worker to a single employer, which of course you can see how that would drastically increase the risk of exploitation and migrant workers' vulnerability to exploitation. So happy to see that that review is called in, and hopefully the government can start looking at some alternatives that are more preventative and better protect migrant workers coming over to New Zealand.
Thank you so much. That also answers my next question, which was sort of like, what improvements can we are still to go? But thank you for that. I think I might ask about COVID now. So the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated a lot of exploitation and trafficking that was already going on here. So what do you think the long-term effects have been 3 years on? Eleanor, I might direct this at you, and also Joanne afterwards, if you'd like to talk about this.
Yeah, sure. Really good question, important question, because of course, when we were having lockdowns and it was all new, there was a huge impact on the risk of exploitation here in New Zealand, particularly sexual exploitation when people were so isolated, you know, young people isolated from their usual communities and support groups, and might have also been, for some of them, unfortunately, tragically stuck at home in dangerous situations, and also spending a lot of time online, which is these days where a lot of sexual exploitation either occurs or where the grooming for it might begin, to then see real world exploitation. So initially with COVID, we saw those real risks. Now, 3 years on, we don't have lockdowns, and so we have different risks, but we're still very much seeing the impact of it. And that's largely through just the ongoing poverty that it has created, and the inequalities in our country that it has really exacerbated. When we look at the young people who are most at risk of sexual exploitation and domestic trafficking, it all ties into those factors around poverty, opportunity, all of them. It's all connected and it can't be looked at in isolation. So that's really important that when we're talking about what the government should be doing now, we can't just look at the anti-trafficking legislation, although I would have plenty to say about what they should be doing with that. We need to look at some of the other work that's done, and it's being done around family violence and sexual violence, that kind of thing. It's a complex picture. And at the moment, the government response is still very disjointed. I definitely agree with what Morgan was saying around some of the improvements that we've seen over the last few years in the government, particularly around the labour exploitation and those risks. And we see some fantastic efforts from individuals in government and individual agencies and governments that are really doing wonderful things and working so hard, but they are working hard with very limited resource and with completely inadequate legislation. Almost across the board, New Zealand is lagging when it comes to our legislation and our policies. Things might look good on paper sometimes, and then it's not really working to serve people in the real world.
Okay, COVID impacted human trafficking dramatically, and we're still seeing the effects of that. It's not decreasing in any way. So with the closing of business and the restrictions that came with COVID, the impacts of COVID, we had this time where so many people were that much more vulnerable. As Eleanor has said, poverty, jobs, having a lack of jobs or access to jobs, created a lot of movement, illegal movement of people across borders looking for ways to make money. And with that vulnerability came the fact that so many are deceived in desperation. So with human trafficking and modern slavery in general, there's always an aspect of vulnerability in people. And it's those that prey on that vulnerability that creates these forms of modern slavery. So for us in Hagar, we are still seeing hundreds of girls, for example, just in Cambodia, being returned from bordering countries that were exploited, deceived to move across borders for work, were sold into prostitution, or they were sold as brides. And for many, they were sold and resold multiple times. That these women, well, girls mostly, but women and girls being returned into their nations with nothing after years of abuse is what Hagar specializes in. And for those kind of people, there's so many services that you have to offer them. But as you can see through the other panelists, that this is an issue that takes a lot of collaboration and has to be addressed from so many different sides for us to solve it globally. It's not just like one organization can just do it, because you have to deal with law in each country, which is what we've been talking about here. And then you have to build knowledge and understanding so people can recognize it. Because again, if somebody's kidnapped, like I think the new movie that's out at the moment, Sound of Freedom, has a kidnapping aspect of human trafficking, but that's a very small aspect of what human trafficking looks like. And it's just taking that vulnerability and preying on it and deceiving people that they find themselves in situations where they can't escape.
Thank you both for that. I think, Morgan, you wanted to, add something about things we can do to improve, was it? Or
Oh, I was just, for that
sorry.
tip report question, I was just saying my colleagues probably would have some amazing input as well, but we could either way. I know that was
Okay,
like an
cool.
open-ended question.
No, all good, all good. Cool. I think one thing I wanted to ask before we move on to audience questions is that you mentioned sort of the is it the Human Trafficking Research Coalition? Is that correct? That you're all a part of? I think it would be really interesting if people could know more about it. Is there sort of a website that you all have, or?
Eleanor, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. We would love people to engage if they're interested. The Human Trafficking Research Coalition, we've been around a number of years, and at times, depending on the membership and I suppose the alignment between the strategic priorities of the different organizations involved, we have periods where we're really busy and we do a lot, and then quieter periods. Our focus, as is in the name, is of course research, so robust academic research. And then we use that for advocacy. And that's a really important part of what we do. So making submissions, whether it's at a national level or whether we're making submissions through the United Nations processes or other international processes to put pressure on the New Zealand government to step up and do more. Because as we've seen, like with the modern slavery legislation, it really does take that pressure from the public to get the government acting. So we'll use the bottom-up pressure, we'll use top-down pressure in our advocacy, and the really important thing is that we have that collaboration and coordination across the different organizations and NGOs involved, like the ones represented here today. We're so much more powerful when we can align and coordinate our advocacy, and we really do encourage people to get involved with that.
That's really great. Thank you so much. Sorry, one other thing is there anything you would all like to add before we move on to audience questions?
I would just like to say, I think it takes, and following on from what Eleanor said, it takes people raising their voice, and it takes, if there's not an awareness around the problem of modern slavery, both overseas and in New Zealand, like particularly in New Zealand, a lot of people think it doesn't happen. So I think, if there isn't that awareness, then change isn't going to happen. So I just wanted to say thank you to you guys for making this documentary, because I think, I watched it and I thought it was amazing. And I think that the more awareness you can bring to the issue, the more we'll see that kind of as a catalyst for change. So thanks to you guys.
Thank you so much for attending and watching and doing all the work you do. Okay, Sophie, do you want to ask? Or I guess, okay, so now we're opening up the floor for audience questions. So just please send in any that you have to the chat, any of our attendees.
Or you can just speak them out loud too, either is fine.
Yeah, sure.
There's one question here from Andrea. I'll just read it out. She says, "Hi everyone, a question for Joanne. Would you say New Zealand is a trafficking hub, or is it mostly an in-between location?"
On comparison with other countries, what is happening in New Zealand is much smaller, of course. We're a smaller country, and we have a lot of those protections in place. But according to the TIP report, anyways, we are both a source and a destination country for human trafficking. And because, again, that can take so many different forms, and Eleanor's able to speak to the child abuse aspect of that, child sexual exploitation, but also, it's now that we're such a diverse community in New Zealand as well, there's a lot of other cultural elements that are coming into place. You can see like the Matamata case where Samoans were coming into New Zealand, but it will still be going the other way as well. And people who are going to another country thinking that they're going to a specific job can still be deceived and arrive to something that isn't what it was supposed to be, and find themselves in a country where they don't have rights and they don't know how to get help.
Great, thank you very much. We've got a question from James as well here. He asks, "Is there anything we can do to help as the general population, since the most common way we are able to provide a little help is through signing petitions? Are there any active methods for us, like events?" And that question is to everyone.
I definitely think so, particularly in an election season, and I'll just speak from the kind of modern slavery legislation standpoint. Um, One, I think, things like signing petitions and open letters is huge. We've seen how much, this whole modern slavery legislation campaign really started with a petition that got signed by 37,000 New Zealanders, and that exposure and that amount of signatures is what got it heard in Parliament, or in government. And so I think that never underestimate the power of you just signing something on Action Station. In terms of events, we're in an election season. Politicians from all political parties are hosting meet and greets, coffee chats, public meetings. So if this is an issue you're really passionate about, you can go on their website, find these events. There's probably quite a few close to where you live. Show up and say, I have a question. This issue is something that will impact my vote, and then you can ask what they're doing to address slavery, to address trafficking, etc. And I think that actually does go a long way.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add?
With Hagar, I also do events that are awareness raising. For example, I have something on Sunday in Auckland that is about modern slavery and about different food brands that you can support who are working to mitigate slavery and child labor in their supply chains.
I would just add, as well as those ways of getting involved mentioned by Morgan and Joanne, speak up about the experiences of young people, what you're seeing, what you're doing, what you're not seeing, what you're not doing, because there are a lot of decisions being made, there are trainings being developed, and they're all about keeping young people safe. And if they're being done without the knowledge of young people and without the input of young people, they're only ever going to be so effective. I have seen some that just they're not going to work because it might seem like great advice in these trainings or in these plans of action, but it doesn't work on the ground. It doesn't work for young people today. The way you interact in this online world is so different to what the people who are currently making the legislation and running the trainings know. So we need to hear from you. We need your involvement. We need your advocacy, whether it's signing a petition, but whether it's maybe getting more involved and really sharing your experiences. Make sure you're part of those conversations.
Great, thank you, Eleanor. That's what we're trying to do here as well, but it'd be great to get more young people involved, especially with different life experiences than us. I think we have time for one more question. We've just got 8 minutes left on the recording as well. So we have one more question from Cindy, which is for everybody. Do your organizations have a lot of collaboration with each other? So I guess maybe expanding on what you guys said earlier, do you work on things outside of the trafficking report together?
Oh, Eleanor.
Definitely, 100%. We all work together through the Human Trafficking Research Coalition, but then because all of our organizations have slightly different focuses and different strengths, there's also a lot of cases where maybe just two organizations might work together. ECPAT and Hagar have had a relationship for a long time, and we're all very supportive of each other's work and putting each other's names forward when we see opportunities to have impact. So it's very collaborative, which is so important. And increasingly, we're starting to see some collaboration between government and nonprofit as well, which is really good.
Yeah, I think that's a very good summary. That's exactly what's going on. And that applies globally as well, in collaborating with other governments and other national institutions across the world, different global legal organizations. All those kind of collaborations are vital to being able to stop this abuse.
I think in New Zealand as well, I feel like there's quite a lot of collaboration between NGOs coming. I've come from the States, so I think just seeing how well NGOs work together here has been really amazing. And for example, on that open letter, we had just had an open letter campaign for that was an open letter to the government to progress modern slavery legislation, which they then did, which was really amazing. But for that, we reached out to, both ECPAT and Hagar and asked for them to sign our open letter. And, when you come to the government, just as your organization, sometimes you can get, a little bit done. But once you come with 20 NGOs having signed your letter or your petition, there's a lot more weight behind that and uniting with each other.
This kind of collaboration is also really important because even though some of the exploitation we're seeing does just happen domestically, there is definitely that international component to it, including with what ECPAT do when people send in a report of maybe they've come across child abuse material online, and so they report that to ECPAT. We then have an agreement where we send it through to the DIA, who lead the government's work around that online safety, and the DIA then have their things in place where they're coordinating with Interpol at that international level. You really can't tackle a global problem just individually at a country or community level or within one organization. So it's good to see that kind of collaboration happening too.
Yeah, thank you guys for that so much. I've just got one more really quick question. If you can just give a 1 minute sort of opinion on one from Anthony saying, do you think we're going to have more big cases uncovered like Mata Mata in New Zealand?
100%. Unfortunately, this problem is getting worse, not better. And with technology just racing ahead the way it is, cryptocurrencies and different things that they can be used for good, but unfortunately they can be used to facilitate some of these really awful crimes as well. And so there's like this ongoing game of catch up that we're playing to a certain extent. And this is an extremely lucrative business we're talking about. When you're talking about selling a person or exploiting a person for financial profit, that is not something that is then used up quickly. They can be sold again and again and money continually made from them as though they are a product. And so I don't see that as going anywhere anytime soon, which might be an unpopular opinion because, of course, we all have as our mission statements like stamp out slavery, end exploitation. We're really just all doing whatever we can to try and minimize it, prevent it, respond to the risks, make sure there are services there for people who do experience it. But I would fully be expecting us to see more cases of it arising over the years, unfortunately.
Okay.
And I think oh, sorry. I was going to jump in.
Just really quickly, we're about to run out of time with that meeting.
Oh, no.
I've only got the free version.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say really quickly, and we need to uncover them. We know the Global Slavery Index estimated there's about 8,000 people in modern slavery in New Zealand. So we know it's happening. So we need to find it and address it and, help the people that have been victim of that.
Yeah, for sure. And 8,000 is a really big number. I think we don't realize how many it is. Thank you so much. And thank you for answering our audience questions as well. I'll just pass it back over to Olivia now so she can close us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor, Morgan, and Joanne, so much for coming. We really appreciate that. That was great. We really learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too. I'll wrap it up by saying, everyone check out the Human Trafficking Research Coalition. It's great work that you all do, and also check out everyone's organization. So Eleanor with ECPAT, Morgan with World Vision, and Joanne with Hagar. So thank you so much. And I guess we'll sign off now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
guys.
That
It was great to have you all in a panel together. Okay, so do I end it and then I get the recording?
You should do. I think you can stop the recording and then but either way I think you get it.
But I'll still get the recording, eh?
Yeah, and then cut out this part.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.